Hello, everyone, and welcome to this really exciting In Conversation event that is live streamed from our office in London. I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive here at ODI, and I'm really delighted to be joined this morning by Emma Dabiri to discuss if and how coalitions can counter these anti-feminist movements that we are all witnessing, so-called backlash. So we just had a conversation saying maybe we should just call it an anti-feminist and anti-rights movement. We'll get into that. Before I introduce the event, I just want to remind everyone that I'll be coming to you for questions and comments after I've start the conversation with Emma, and also for our online audience, I'll be taking questions and comments from you. So, sort of put your contributions in the chat and the live stream that you see on your screen. We've been working on this for quite some time at ODI. We've been really involved in trying to open up, the conversation around feminist movements, the incredible impact and change that are driving, how they're doing that, how they work on the front line, how they put themselves, particularly feminist activists, sort of working tirelessly in exhausting ways to really try and change norms in their society. And we are doing that because there is a patriarchal resurgence in the world. There's no question about it, and this cuts across everywhere, from rich countries to global majority countries. We see very harmful narratives around gender that are being weaponized to really roll back the progress, very fragile progress that we have made towards gender equality. The Global Philanthropy Project estimated that between 2008 and 2017, the aggregate revenue of organizations that are associated with the anti-feminist movements was about 6.2 billion. But this is only what we can track. This is what's above, the ground. We don't know how much more is going, to fund this anti-feminist movement. And, we've seen very recently in Uganda the passing of extreme laws against LGBTQI people. Today is 1 year from the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US, and we see in the US state legislatures passing bills almost every day that are restricting gender diversity from education and public life. And quite frankly, even in the UK, we're seeing our civic space being restricted. We're seeing laws against democratic protests that are curtailing people's rights to demand change. So that's why we've invited Emma to join us in conversation today, to really hear your take on what is needed to stem this very powerful tide that we're seeing of anti-rights actors that are determined to halt and erode freedoms for everyone. Emma's most recent book, I'm sure a number of you will have read it, What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalitions, really sets out a compelling argument from why coalitions are vital, which is really why we wanted to talk to you, because you argue how coalition can really help dismantle this, persistent injustice that cuts across the different levels of the political, economic, social level. And, we've seen conversations about racism and allyship become more mainstream since the murder of George Floyd in 2020, but it's very clear that we need a lot more, to really confront the gaps. So we want to discuss what collaboration looks like to tackle, these trends. Let me introduce you before I start the conversation. Emma is a pioneering Irish-Nigeria historian, broadcaster, best-selling author. Her latest book, which I just mentioned, What White People Can Do Next, was released in April 2021 and was immediately Times and Sunday Times bestseller. And it followed, her debut work that I enjoy very much, Don't Touch My Hair, which was an Irish Times bestseller and really inspired a national conversation around race and hair, and actually brought some very tangible change, in the British Army, in schools, where regulations were changed. Her interdisciplinary work crosses African studies, art, sociology, history, film, literature, theater. You are a powerhouse, popular culture, music. but Emma is also a teaching fellow at SOAS.
I'm actually not anymore.
Oh, you're not anymore.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering how you find the time.
I don't, so,
But you still a visually sociology PhD researcher at
Until
Goldsmith.
October I will be, yeah, when
Okay.
I finally end the
Then after this, close doors, you tell me the secret how you managed to do all of this. It's incredible. But I'm really delighted to have you. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So let me get started. You talked very eloquently about these interconnected injustices and really pointing, the forces that disregard Black life, Indigenous people, lives of women are actually the same as those who disregard life on Earth itself. So how do you see this connection between this current, anti-rights movement we're talking about, particularly anti-feminist movement, and these ultra-conservative movements?
Yeah, I think there's they're one and the same, and I think as you've just been saying, whenever there are gains for particular groups, in this instance women who are not a minority group, they're like half of the world's population, or almost half of the world's population. I believe there are slightly more men in the world, I think 1% or something, but yeah, half of the world's population essentially, so not a minority group. But whenever there are gains for historically oppressed groups, there is almost an inevitable backlash against those gains. You see it with historic regularity from kind of the witch hunts, which I'm actually writing about at the moment. So they're quite prominent in my mind. I'm writing another book called Disobedient Bodies, which is far more about the body and gender. So yeah, I think there are forces that are empowered and thrive on division and on distraction tactics, that through processes of pitting people who actually have shared interests, but pitting people who belong to different demographics, but do have shared interests, pitting them against each other as a distraction kind of tactic, so that the real kind of source of oppression, the oppression that various people experience in multiple different forms, the true source and origin of that is obscured, and people are kind of focusing on the wrong enemy, on this kind of invented enemy. And I think at the moment, like we just live in incredibly polarized times. I don't know that there would be like a comparable point in history, because there hasn't been not that division is new, but there hasn't been the kind of technology that we have now that can kind of sow division so effectively, and can also allow for the transnational spread of particular narratives and rhetoric to kind of be profuse around the world. Say kind of like anti-trans narratives, or this this threat that this idea that because there has been kind of like a fourth wave. I mean, I don't know how I feel about the kind of language around waves of feminism, but we can maybe get into that. But ostensibly this fourth wave of feminism, and women articulating and demanding certain transformations in material transformations that to some degree, have occurred, and that being kind of reimagined as something that is threatening to men. And so you have this idea that men's rights are under threat. Well, what about men? Why aren't you talking about me? But the fact that a lot of men actually do have kind of shitty lives, like a lot of men do suffer from men suffer from the inequalities perpetuated by capitalism. So they might look at their life and be like, well, my life is rubbish. But their life is not rubbish because women are having improvements in their rights. Their lives are rubbish because we live in a predatory economic system. But to kind of stop people thinking about that, you can create stories, create narratives that are like, oh, your rights are under threat because this group is demanding their rights. And I think men and women are really pitted against each other, when in actual fact, as we all know, patriarchy is also in many ways, damaging for men as well. But that's not the story that is told,
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And we've had a lot of discussions here, and including this morning, about how the patriarchy actually affects men as much as it affects women. The counterbalance to that, in a lot of the conversations that we have here at ODI and more broadly, is the concept of allyship that is really, come to the fore, particularly after, the killing of George Floyd and the outpouring of support that we saw for Black Lives Matter. But it's talked about both, in that context, as well as in the support of feminist movement context. But your book, and it really struck me, reading your book, where you challenge the concept of allyship as, patronizing, saying, it can actually reinforce these dynamics of savior and victim. So can you tell us what a more useful alternative would be, that can really, help those who want to align themselves to these progressive movements?
Yeah, because there's in no way was I trying to discourage people from aligning themselves with progressive movements. Quite the contrary. I was trying to write something, to create a new narrative that actually brought more people on board, so that you can create the kinds of mass movements that are kind of so powerful that their demands can't be ignored, rather than atomizing struggles, and through that atomization allowing kind of discourse that pits those struggles against each other, rather than sees them as interconnected. And I had many reservations with allyship, some of which you'd mentioned. Certainly the patronizing nature of a lot of the discourse around allyship, and the explicit language about allies and victims. But I think primarily one of my huge reservations about the way allyship was being kind of described and understood was that the ally, it wasn't connecting the dots between different struggles, but I'm specifically talking about race in the book and what white people can do next. But the kind of narrative within race towards white allies seemed to me in many ways like a reproduction of the kind of white saviorism, and kind of appeals to charity and benevolence that I was very intimate with from having grown up in Ireland in the 1980s and 80s and 90s, when there was a strong relationship between the Catholic Church and missionaries that would go to Africa, and a lot of the ideas about Blackness and about African people came from this dynamic of the missionary and the kind of impoverished the impoverished African. And the language around allyship, I thought, actually reproduced a lot of that dynamic. But yeah, primarily it presented the fight against racial justice as the problem and the concern of Black people and people who are racialized as not white, and other people of color. I actually don't like the term people of color, but I'm just going to use it for brevity. And it kind of presented the call to allyship as it was not sometimes it was a plea, sometimes it was a demand. There were different tonalities in it, but it was this idea that we have this problem and we need help, and it was kind of a reliant on benevolence. Really, why would someone be compelled to help unless they are a nice person, or they want to be good, or they're feeling charitable? That's too fragile, kind of freedom, liberation, like kind of social justice can't be predicated on the goodwill of an ally. And I was interested in creating a narrative whereby people who are not impacted by racism, because they're white, can see that the system that has... So I take a lot of time in the book to lay out the relationship between the invention of race and subsequently the architecture of race and racism that we now live under, and the origins of capitalism and the interrelated nature of race, racism, and capitalism. And that kind of analysis of capitalism was missing from a lot of the allyship kind of discourse. There was no kind of discussion of capitalism. And so I thought like framing it in that way could allow groups of people who are not affected by racism to understand the ways in which their life opportunities are diminished because of the inequalities perpetuated by capitalism. So they could think about the ways in which they also experience forms of oppression, not racism. I'm being emphatic that white people don't experience racism, but they do experience, diminished life opportunities in many ways, particularly poor white people, of which there are many. So through identifying, through looking at the origin of, or the source of racism, kind of poverty, inequality, you could create coalitions whereby people, even though they are experiencing different forms of oppression, can see that there's a common source that they all come from, so can work together rather than either being pitted against each other or seeing struggles as, even if they're not pitted against each other, seeing somebody else's struggle as something that's not really connected to my own life, but I might help if I'm feeling benevolent, or I might give the illusion of helping so I'm not shamed online. Because also a lot of it was just like deeply performative. People actually didn't give a shit, but they needed to present themselves as though they did. Yeah.
And
so that was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
No, but so you're absolutely right in terms of how we connect the struggles, and I'm just thinking, how would you then talk about gender equality particularly differently to make sure that we are truer to what we're trying to achieve rather than performative?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of like thinkers that I am inspired by that write about coalition. There's actually, I reference his work a lot. There's a Black American critic called Fred Moten, who talks. He has a really famous, well, it's quite like a cult underground famous book, but some people might be familiar with it. It's called The Underplannings, the Undercommons, Black Study and Fugitive Planning. The Undercommons is the main title. And in that, he talks about the fact that, people might think that they're being kind of like hip or progressive in being feminist. Like a man might think he's like kind of down and like just like cool feminist dude. But it's still kind of like a favor that he's doing for women, rather than seeing his own liberation as intimately kind of like interconnected to the liberation of women. And in the book that I'm writing at the moment, Disobedient Bodies, I've just been looking at Thomas Sankara, who was the short-lived presidency, because of course he was assassinated, of Burkina Faso. And in the revolution where they took control of Burkina Faso and made huge, hugely dramatic improvements to the life of the entire population in a short period of time, but of course his presidency was cut short. one of the things that was kind of central to Sankara's vision was the idea that women's role in liberation, in the liberation struggle, was not just the liberation of the whole country, the transformation of the whole country, of the economy, of the social conditions, of everything, was also dependent on the freedom of women. And it wasn't this kind of add-on, or this attitude of this is something we should kind of be doing because it's the right thing to do, but it was actually like an acknowledgement of the fact that it was integral to the success of his vision, that half of the population of the country wasn't oppressed by patriarchal norms. So I think it's about creating narratives, new ways of talking about gender, the word equality, like about gender, and the relationship between men and women, that have a kind of inbuilt resistance to the forces that will attempt to kind of pit the two against each other, and will attempt to persuade men that women's freedom is a threat to their freedom, rather than being like intimately bound up with it.
Yeah, I think it's to the core of how we're going to make change, and at the same time, as you say, it's also moving away from this benevolence that yes, we do a little bit just to help women, and that will sort of help progress, which is deeply infuriating. One important focus of your book is obviously on the role of coalitions, how we bring together collective responses, because much as all of us try, well, at least I hope in this room, to counter this anti-rights movement, we do need to come together. And there is a quote that you include in your book by George Lipsitz I want to share that I really loved. You say that good intentions and spontaneity are not adequate in the face of relentlessly oppressive and powerful economic and political systems, which is exactly what we're facing. So given how vast the scale of the challenge is, you say very clearly it's imperative that we stop being ad hoc in the way we try and counter this, and work more intentionally together. So what would an anti-feminist, a movement to the counter, sorry, we know very well how an anti-feminist movement and coalition comes together. What was a movement that is really able to counter this, anti-feminist coalition that does exist, is well organized, well resourced, well networked, intentional and focused? We are not. Yeah. How can we really, bring together an effective coalition? And is that a globally coordinated one? Is it one that is more localized? What is the best approach?
Yeah, so I think there's there's great power in in international solidarity and having a sense of internationalism. I feel that I'm actually just going to take it back a moment to anti-racism to kind of make this point. So one of the reasons that another one of the reasons that I wrote What White People Can Do Next was I was also concerned that even though conversations about anti-racism were quite zeitgeisty and were mainstream, it was all actually quite amorphous. I didn't have a strong sense of actually precisely what it was that people were demanding. There were just there was a lot of conversation about privilege, but I was like, what actually specifically is it that we're demanding? What is it that we want? So I went back to recent history, but another moment in history when race was also very high on the agenda. All forms of kind of equality and justice in the late 1960s, and I looked at the Black Panther Party, who, in terms of organizational kind of methods, are really interesting. I know they're kind of largely seen, they're presented in a very kind of one-dimensional way in popular culture, but in terms of organizing around race, and actually not just race, because their vision came to be about freedom from oppression, for all exploited people. They actually had a very inclusive vision as they kind of evolved. And one of the things that I thought was so powerful about, like, obviously, like, it didn't work, but I think when things, and similarly, Thomas Sankara's vision didn't work, but
it may have.
It's never allowed. These things aren't allowed to work. If it looks like they might bring around a real transformation of kind of material conditions, they will usually be stopped with might. They'll be crushed. So the fact that they didn't work isn't to diminish that they have the potential, to be successful. But what I thought was really interesting about the Black Panthers and the White Panthers, who formed as well subsequently, was their 10-point plan. So they just had 10 very explicit demands, which are actually, like, not that radical. They're asking for, they're demanding healthcare, housing, education. It's not, they're not radical demands. But when you have identified exactly what it is that you are demanding, that you're fighting for, that you are trying to create, then you have that focus. So any activity or aim that is not oriented towards achieving those demands is something you can just kind of disregard. But when you don't have that kind of like definite vision, it's just kind of, it's splintered, and it's different people doing this thing and that thing, and often contradictory forces at play. And that was the kind of disorganized, amorphous kind of situation that seemed to be around kind of like racial justice discourse in that aftermath after George Floyd's murder. So I think that identifying like definite something, like, it sounds so, sometimes things just sound too easy and straightforward, but like literally, like, kind of having a 10-point plan, and then having people who, something else that's interesting about the Black Panthers is the Rainbow Coalition that one of them, Fred Hampton, started, where he was able to work in coalition with various groups who were not the kind of natural kind of bedfellows of the Black Panthers, but I think most interestingly with a white Southern, with a group of white Southerners who had the Confederate flag as their symbol. So I think that gives you some indication into their kind of attitudes towards race. But in Hampton's vision, he felt that even though that group didn't experience racism, they did experience police brutality, as Black Americans did, and they did experience incredibly like impoverished, disenfranchised lives. So he was like, there's lots of poor white people. If we can work with them, we are going to have, our numbers are going to be far bigger. So, and to come back to what you were saying, they didn't always work together because they were like antithetical in many ways. They didn't always work in the same space, but they were coordinated so that they were working according to the same kind of like set of demands. So how can you bring in people that are presented, or not even presented, that may actually be in many ways like antithetical to your group? How can you identify where you have common ground, and how can you find ways of working together, not just for the fun of it, but just so you can create mass movements that have so many people working within them that like you're too powerful to be ignored.
Very interesting. I want to open to the audience, but one last question. I mean, for coalitions to work well, they need to be well resourced. Mm-hmm. And clearly, the anti-rights, anti-feminist coalition is making strides because it is well resourced and, as I was saying before, well networked, well organized. The progressive one is not. If you look, obviously, not many governments are funding them, and philanthropies are not funding them, as much as it would be hoped. I mean, it's only 8% of philanthropic funding that goes to feminist causes, to sort of gender equality work. What role do you think philanthropists can play in support these coalitions?
Yeah, I think like when you say that the anti-feminist right wing conservative, when you identify rightly that they are extremely well funded and strategic in their vision and in the types of narratives and discourse that they disseminate throughout our societies and globally. There needs to be a well orchestrated, coordinated response to that, and that obviously requires funding, which can be provided by philanthropists. So that would So I think that like having that having access to those resources is really necessary in being able to do the research and work of creating, because like to have to create a international coalitions of these different interest groups would require like a lot of resources. So
Yeah, I guess we also need to be able to inspire philanthropists to, sort of really encourage them. So those who have the ability to influence and, to encourage them to feel. Sometimes there are issues in terms of not knowing who exactly to fund, how these coalitions come together, which is what I was asking. Should that be a global one, a local one? That would also, I guess, sort of perhaps stimulate more support.
Well, I think the encouragement should be, again, it's not necessarily like a plea for charity, but it's about demonstrating because philanthropists are also, human beings that live on this planet, and about demonstrating how, these forces that are gathering might and strength and power are like a real threat to the safety and like prosperity of our of our existence, so it's actually within their kind of like personal interests as well to kind of try and like prevent that from happening.
Great. Let me open to the audience. Please raise your hand if you want to ask Emma questions. Say who you are. There is a roving mic over there. I'll start with those in the room and then I'll go to the online audience.
Thanks very much for a really wonderful conversation. I just had a few observations and one question, really. My name is Catherine Nwajaku-Dahu. I'm the Director of the Politics and Governance team here. The observations were that, interestingly, the ideas that you shared in terms of Black Panthers, but also Thomas Sankara, are ideas and movements that have traveled over time. So I live in France, I live in Paris, and Thomas Sankara has become like a symbol for young people living in a banlieue, where in the suburbs, where you see big graffiti of Thomas Sankara, even though in Burkina Faso itself, his memory has been challenged. But interesting enough. And also the ideas of Black Panthers, this idea of coalition building with unlikely suspects, are ideas that organizations like the Othering and Belonging Institute from Berkeley, people like Jonathan Powell, taking really seriously, because it's a critical mass question. And so that's inspiring. My question was really, in light of your earlier book, and your observations about the allyship question, just to get a sense of what you think as what has happened since that moment, that George Floyd moment, when it would seem that everyone was in it and in on it. We're here in ODI, trying to continue to walk through the doors of opportunity that were created by that moment, decolonizing the way we're thinking about the production of knowledge, putting racial justice very firmly in the work that we do, and even our intellectual production. But there are conversations about how narrow that window is, how open it is. where are you seeing things? I mean, in terms of that moment, has the door closed on the appetite for kind of racial justice, or are you more hopeful?
Thanks, Catherine. Let me see if I have one online while people in the room come back. Karen Wybro, no affiliation given, says, I'm currently writing a paper for my PhD about the backlash to anti-sexual harassment campaigns. I'm finding the right-wing ideologies pushing anti-feminist rhetoric mainstream. How do we build successful online counter-narratives without the divisive nature that creates further digital enclaves?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to start with that, and then we can come back to the room.
Yeah, I'll start with that one, and then I'll come to yours. So online, wow. Okay, so like a platform like Twitter, it actually like incentivizes division, and the more kind of reactionary your content, the more engagement it gets. So the more it kind of presses people's buttons, the more engagement you can create for yourself, and then kind of by extension, the more influence you can have. So I think like that's tricky because people are are incentivized to actually be kind of really reactionary. I've like personally taken and so I don't know if like there's in terms of like legislation, I think like something probably has to happen with Twitter. I just think it's particularly obnoxious and really
especially lately to some of the cesspit.
Yeah, cesspool. Like it really is. And I think the proliferation of so many of these ideas occurs there. This is an individual. So there's a question of legislation and kind of like official responses to it on a personal level. And I actually don't like to like overemphasize individual action. I don't think individual action can ever kind of be like the solution, but just in terms of like personal integrity, I just won't argue with people online. Like I just won't feed into that, even if I'm right, which of course I am. I just won't feed that monster, like feed that machine. And I actually think that, I mean, again, this is just an individualized response and not the solution. But I do think we need to think about how we also like engage on those platforms, because your buttons are really pressed often. But I just think it's important that no matter whether or not we're right or wrong, that we actually say, no, I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to play this game.
I think it goes beyond that. It goes on challenging that business model that is predicated on the algorithm rewarding that particular exactly. Sort of negative content, because it generates more engagement and reactions, and so it goes to the heart of having a conversation with the capitalists you were talking about what to drive business. They actually whether inadvertently or deliberately sort of producing as the byproduct then in terms of societal division. But sorry, carry on.
No.
So we do a lot of work on this at ODI, so we are very passionate about how we can engage, in the online violence, and particularly misogynistic content. It's a big part of the story today.
Yeah. It's really. I actually think I was kind of not oblivious, but I wasn't aware the level of misogyny that was online until relatively recently. And when I kind of like uncovered that world, I was just like, this is terrifying.
If you come to Catherine's question, I've got more online.
Yeah. I don't know how I feel. I think that there's been progress. I guess I don't have one definitive answer in terms of yes, there's been progress or like there hasn't been. I think in certain quarters there has been, and I think in others we are where we were when George Floyd was murdered, and in fact society is just becoming, and like kind of inequality and racism are actually like deepening in many ways. But I think maybe in like corporate spaces, in some aspects of where I think there's been like huge change is in terms of, you know, representation in the media. But what does that translate into, you know? But that's somewhere where visibly we can see change. And I know that like there have been opportunities that have become available for kind of like individual Black people, but I don't know how kind of transformative or wholesale that is in any kind of more structural way. I think the kind of architecture of race that was designed when race, the modern idea we have of a Black race and a white race comes from the period of transatlantic slave trade. And I haven't really seen, what I tried to do with What White People Can Do Next was kind of mainstream the ideas about the constructed nature of the category Black and white, and the reason those racial categories were invented and the work that they serve to continue to do. But I still don't think that awareness or understanding is really mainstream. And I think it's a shame that it didn't happen in that moment when we were all talking about race, because I feel if it didn't become understood in that period, I don't know when it ever will be. I don't know when we'll have a moment like that again, even though there have been so many murders since then. So I actually don't have a straightforward answer to that.
Let me come to more questions. So there is one from Sophia, no affiliation given. She asks, do you think that big coalitions like the UN Women Generation Equality Forum process can play a role in countering the anti-feminist movement? And what would be necessary to make coalitions like this successful? Are they too broad and unorganized?
I missed the beginning of the question, I'm sorry.
So there's one coalition, one of many, it's the Generation Equality Forum that is sort of organized by UN Women and
UN.
UN.
Okay.
Yeah. She's asking, you know, can they be successful as a coalition, or are they too broad and unorganized to be effective?
Yeah, I don't know about because a lot of the like relationships between like kind of global North institutions and the global South are predicated on, irrespective of what they say, are predicated on a relationship of like domination and subordination. So I don't have like great faith in those institutions to bring about the kind of like transformation that is required. But I'm sure there are they may have mechanisms in place because they are like, you know, funded and organized to some degree, where they could be where they could have a role in working with other maybe like more grassroots organizations. But I really do think it's imperative that we're honest about the relationship between those big global North institutions and their role in patriarchy, violence, but just the poverty that continues to be entrenched in much of the world, you know, obviously finds its origins and its continued perpetuation in the unequal, which then leads to a lot of the gender kind of violence that we see.
finds its origin in this relationship between the global north and the global south, of kind of subordination.
You seem to
and domination.
suggest more, distributed, obviously, coalitions led by activists are closer to the
yes,
the matter.
Yes.
Yes. Great. Let me see if there are other questions in the room. We have a shy audience this morning, which I know is not. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the space. Nice to meet you. My name is Cecilia Milesi. I'm just starting supporting ODI in the strategy of decolonization. I'm originally from South America, Argentina. I'm wondering, I'm not from the UK, not from the US, not from the global north. I'm wondering, how do you see yourself in your studies? I mean, in the way you are doing your research, how do you see this level of interest in the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and many other Black people being killed in the UK or the US, and how that differs with the interest and the attention to the Black people that is being killed in the global South every day?
Was the question the level of attention of Black people who are...
How do you analyze that different level of attention
on Black deaths in the global north
and the Black deaths
and
in
the global south? Yeah. I guess it's to do with like who is afforded humanity, whose lives are seen as valuable, and whose narratives it's complicated because it's complicated. I do think in England it has to do with language and the fact that like in America, obviously America is an English speaking country, and so I think like black Britishness certainly is like very, very like informed and influenced by Black American culture, and actually there's often a tendency to just kind of cut and paste Black American narratives onto the UK context in a way that is actually like quite inaccurate and misleading often. But I think there's a particular dynamic between the relationality between kind of like Black America and Black Britain. Because I've not lived I wrote a paper, an article in the Guardian actually some time ago, many years ago, but actually about this, and it was looking at the fact that there had just been another, and I mean this situation has only deteriorated since I wrote this about 6 years ago, that there had been another boat capsizing in the Mediterranean, and it was particularly full of African migrants, and lots of African migrants had gone missing and drowned, and there was very little discourse around that in this country at the time. But a Black person had been shot by the police in America, and there were protests outside the American embassy. And I was asking the same question that you're asking, without necessarily answering it. But yeah, I think it's to do with who people see as recognizable to themselves, which also doesn't make sense because most of the Black population here is like of recent African of recent African migration. But yeah, I totally observe the phenomenon that you're talking about, but I don't necessarily have a straightforward answer. Thank you.
Let me just bring, oh gosh, everybody, you have to be super quick because I need to close the conversation. We both have trains to catch. Caroline or Nilima first, then Caroline.
Nilima Gulrajani, ODI.
Hi.
You seem to suggest that true allyship comes from opposing or in opposition to the capitalist system, which in a way draws a very narrow coalition of actors to play. What role then for governments who maybe are not exponents of capitalism, but certainly you could call them exponents, or for philanthropy, given a lot of corporate foundations are in fact representatives or pseudo representatives of the capitalist system that have made them successful, that they can donate money now.
Yeah.
Thanks. So let me take Caroline, and then we'll just do one last
Okay.
round.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm Caroline Harper. I run the gender program here at ODI. I'm particularly inspired by, attracted to your ideas about how the anti-feminist movement pitches people against each other so skillfully. So at the moment, women are pitched against women. We can see it very clearly in the trans debate, where women are just being forced to argue with women, and that's all the media are interested in. They're not interested in the bigger issues, and the media is so complicit in this whole narrative of pitching people against each other, and so skillful. And I feel like I'm asking you to solve the world's problems, but is it coalitions that can? We've been doing this for generations. Fighting against this sort of what is capitalism and patriarchy together, and where is the point of traction? How can we together actually push back forcefully against this?
Thank you.
Back to you.
Yeah, I think it's so the forces of it's so disheartening when you see so that there's groups that are kind of seen as being like quite antithetical to each other or antithetical to each other, like I gave the example from the Rainbow Coalition. But then when you see the level of infighting that occurs between groups, there's that narcissism of like small difference, like between groups that are essentially just the same, but they have these like granular kind of like microscopic differences that then like facilitate the splintering of that group. I think we have to just be really vigilant in being. There needs to be like just a great awareness of the fact that like division is like the best weapon that can be used against us, and I think we just have to like keep a hold of the fact that, so I always say that like it's like solidarity is subversive. There are so many because like having kind of more oppositional stances can seem, or kind of segregationist stances, that can seem like it's a a kind of radical way to be, but really that serves the interests of all of the groups that benefit from division. So in actual fact, it's solidarity is harder to kind of cultivate, but it's solidarity that is subversive. So I think we just really have to keep a hold of that. And again, like in terms of coalition, I always think as well of like the Combahee River Collective, and how even in their their manifesto, the concept of coalition is central to that. So even though they introduced they coined the phrase identity politics, and they've come together as being like Black, lesbian, socialist women, but central to their mission is to work in coalition with all other groups that are committed to kind of like progressive ideas, white people, men, across the board. And I think that concept of, I actually heard one of the original members speaking recently, and she was saying that there's a generation of feminists who've come a few generations after them who seem to have taken the identity but like dropped the politics on the floor. And I was like, wow, that's quite damning to hear her say that. So I think we have to just keep reminding ourselves of the importance of solidarity. In answer to your question, I don't think that organizing around, I don't think that creates a situation that only has like a narrow interest group. I think the ways of the way that we live, the deep and entrenched poverty and inequality that is, just kind of increasingly a feature of so many of our lives, not just in the global south, very much in this part of the world as well, is like a very powerful, because people are like feeling this, they're living it. If they
identify, if they are shown, because this is often obscured, the reason that their lives are so unnecessarily difficult is because of a kind of predatory, like wealth hoarding elite. You can actually, I think you have the scope to build mass movements that are inclusive of so many people, because almost everybody is affected by this, and even the people who are materially enriched by this system are still having to inhabit an earth that is going to be soon be uninhabitable because of the economic system that we live under. So I think it actually has the potential of bringing like most of the world on board. And in terms of governments, I think it really depends on like who the government is, which is why it's really important that we organize, that people vote in ways that so that we have politicians who, you know, might be far from ideal, but are at least are not committed to kind of asset stripping the country, and then once they're in power, once the politicians, you know, that you want are in power, it's not about like just being like, oh well, whoever won, but it's about like maintaining the pressure on them to force them, you know, to kind of act in the best interests of the majority of people in the country. But to be able to enact that pressure requires like very strong organizing and coalition, you know. And then in terms of the media, I interviewed, I had a conversation with Bernie Sanders recently in his book, his new book, It's Okay to Be Angry at Capitalism. And he spoke about the importance of like diverse media and media that isn't just part of the like local media. This is in the American context, but the importance of local media and how actually local media is being completely you know, just like underfunded, and it's just kind of like dying out. And so then that leaves us very vulnerable to the kind of ravages of these big media conglomerates, who are often, you know, aligned with right-wing and kind of reactionary forces. So yeah, I guess it also like support like independent media is something we can do.
Emma, we're very much at time. Do you have any final 30-second message, anything you haven't been able to cover? Because we really
I'm
need
just
to
going to
close.
reiterate that, yeah, like this idea that solidarity is subversive, and that it's really important that we are aware of the ways in which division is used to prevent us from operating and organizing according to our own best interests. So even though kind of like divisive rhetoric might feel, you know, kind of like all the dopamine is like, you know, you're getting the hits when you're having like this like crazy like kind of Twitter exchange and you're owning them and whatever, but that is really like just feeding into this environment, this kind of toxic environment of division, which is really being manipulated, you know, to stop us from to make us act against our own best interests.
Thank you so much. That was very much what I had written down, as well as my, you know, key takeaway. What you said, solidarity is much harder to cultivate, but it is subversive, and I think this is a moment to be subversive and to work a bit harder, because yes, it's harder to cultivate, but if we don't, the alternative, it's really too dummy to consider. So it's really a great call to be a little bit more energized and active in sort of countering those who would like us go back to a period where our rights were even less sort of protected and affirmed than they are today. And we can't slide back any farther. Emma, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you everyone everyone who is here in London and the online audience. For those who are here, you can carry on, you know, chatting in the lounge. I think there are some refreshments, but please, before you do that, join me in thanking Emma Dabiri very much for being with us today.